Okay, I can't tell you how depressed I am because I already did this once and I lost it. So now I have to do it again. So, anyway, maybe I'll. What can I say? You didn't need to know that, did you? Anyway, this is the part two of podcast 39. First part, we've spent talking about the foundations behind Darwin's ideas and the people that laid those foundations for him, the fossils, the idea of an ancient Earth, this idea of slow, steady processes being able to cause enormous change in the Earth itself, and how this kind of laid Darwin's thinking at the bottom of his thinking as its foundation. We talked about Lamarck, don't forget him, and don't forget to try not to use those ideas of acquired characteristics or the language of that as you talk about what Darwin said about natural selection. All right, let us talk about what indeed Darwin did say about natural selection. Charles Darwin, we've already know his time frame, and that he proposed this idea. And what you may not realize is what he did that was so incredible was the amount of evidence he compiled to support this idea. This was not a flash in the pan idea for Charles Darwin. It wasn't, this looks likely. He amassed an enormous amount of evidence. No one amassed this amount of evidence before they brought it forward to the scientific community. But he was so reticent to ever bring this idea forward that he just kept collecting evidence, and shoring up his ideas even more, because he really wasn't eager to lay this out to the public because he thought that people weren't going to be real happy with him. His own wife really was quite she loved him. They had a wonderful relationship, but she was really pretty disturbed that he might be implying that organisms weren't all placed here at once by the Creator 6,000 years ago, and she worried about him. Okay. So let's talk about the beginnings of Charles Darwin as we think of him as a biologist. He had been a drifting young man, certainly not a loss. He was well liked, he was gregarious, he had many friends, and was clearly very bright. But his father kept wanting him to take a position somewhere and learn a gentleman's, have a career. He wanted him to be a doctor. Darwin could not stomach, nor could I, the kind of doctoring that was done in the 1800s, where there was no anesthesia and there was surgery without anesthesia, and he didn't have much of a stomach for that. His father then tried to get him into the ministry, and he tried that for a while, and Darwin was a Christian. He was raised a Christian. He had no problems with that, but it was kind of a listless. He just couldn't find his niche in the world. And finally, this opportunity arose where this ship, the HMS Beagle, was about to embark on a journey down to map the coast of South America. Europeans didn't know a whole lot about South America at the time, so this ship their job was to go down and see what South America was all about and map the coast. Captain Fitzroy, Robert Fitzroy down here, was the captain of the ship, and in those days the captains were not to fraternize with the crew. It wasn't appropriate. The captain really needed a gentleman aboard the ship to be his companion, to talk with, to eat meals with, and so on. And so Darwin was recommended for this position. He was 22 years old, a very young man with this incredible opportunity to sail to a place that very few Europeans had ever seen. And his job, in addition to being the gentleman companion for the captain, was to make observations of the South American coast about the natural world. He was to be the ship's naturalist. He would collect organisms, specimens. He would, take notes about the life forms and the geology and so on of the South American coast. Indeed, he embarked on this trip. And they set sail from England down the coast, and for every step of the way, just about, Charles Darwin was seasick. He never got his sea legs about him and was very ill every time he got on the boat. So he got off the boat every chance he got. In fact, he would get off the boat when they would make a stop down at South America, and he would walk quite a distance, which he needed to do anyway to do his job, but then he would get back up on the boat and sail for a little while, but then get off again and walk as long as he could, because the sea did not sit well with him. So they went all around the South American coast, coming up and making a what ultimately would be a very important stop at the Galapagos Islands, though I'm sure no one realized at the time how important that would be, and then sailing back around and all the way around and coming back to England for 5 years. 5 years. Seasick for 5 years, or at least whenever he wasn't on land. All right. So the Galapagos Islands, understanding a little bit about these islands that are so important in the work that Darwin eventually did. They are relatively, geologically speaking, recent islands. They haven't always been there, as much of the Earth's crust has changed over time, but these islands popped up. They are volcanic in origin, so they popped up from underneath the sea, from the ocean floor. And what Darwin noticed was that there were unique species of animals that lived on these different islands. They were unique. Nowhere else in the world were these animals described. But he also noticed that they did tend to resemble species that lived over on the mainland. Yet they were unique to their various island homes over on the Galapagos. It just made an impression on him. It's thought that generally he didn't realize what a big impression it made on him until after he left the islands. But he did begin to think it was really as though those islands had been colonized a long time ago by animals that had somehow strayed from the South American mainland. So if this is South America and these are the Galapagos Islands, maybe some birds got blown by a storm over here and took up residence. And then they kind of changed a little bit. They diversified, and these birds began to colonize the different islands, becoming suited to each island. At least that's what he started to think. Also on their trip, Darwin found fossils and collected them, lots of fossils. And what he noticed was that these fossils he was collecting were clearly not just the same as anything that was currently alive. Yet he also, again, even with these fossils, clearly noticed that the fossils were very South American in their resemblance to living species. They were very much similar to, though certainly not identical to, the species that were on the South American continent. For example, in Argentina, he collected fossils of this enormous sloth, giant sloths, and they were unlike anything else anywhere in the world except sloths that he had seen on South America. They weren't this big, but he did see animals that resembled these sloths on South America, and he found these fossils of these things that were clearly sloths, but way different from what was currently alive on South America. He found those on South America too. Made him think. Armadillos, native to South America. He also found this fossil. unique to South America, nowhere else. So he's thinking there's this extinct armadillo-like thing on South America that I found, and living armadillos that are on the same continent, and both of them are nowhere else. Does that suggest that there's some relationship between them? Darwin kind of thought maybe yes, that is what it suggested. Darwin also found birds. He found lots of birds, collected many different birds, especially on the Galapagos. He thought he had found many different kinds of birds. He thought he had found a finch here, a sparrow here, a woodpecker, a warbler. But when he brought these specimens that he had found back to England and showed them to an expert, the expert looked at them, and these were not, no one had ever seen these species before because no one had been down there before. But when the expert looked at them, he said, well, you don't really have a bunch of completely different kinds of birds. What you have are finches. They are different finches, but they're 13 species of finch. This is called now a large ground finch. This is called a small ground finch, a woodpecker finch, a warbler finch. And yet there is only one species of finch on the mainland. So all of these finches did not get blown over to the relatively new Galapagos from the mainland. There's only one species of finch there. So what Darwin began to wonder, did one species from the mainland get blown over to the Galapagos and become eventually many different finch species? And if they did, how? So this is when Darwin basically started thinking of things in the terms of a tree, that perhaps there was one ancestor at the base of this tree, and slowly over time it gave rise to many species that were slightly different from the common ancestor. Okay, so the ancestor is the bottom of the tree, the descendants are at the tips of the branches of the tree. The ancestor is at the bottom of the tree, the descendants are at the tips of the branches of the tree. And what he noticed with these finches was that the species correlated to the food source that was on the island. The seed eaters had certain types of beaks. The flower eaters had certain types of beaks. The insect eaters had certain types of beaks. And they all seem to have come from this one common ancestor that was commonly found on mainland South America. This idea that one ancestor could give rise to many different species is called adaptive radiation. Radiation means you go out from a center point. Many species arising from a single common ancestor, adapting to different environments. Okay? So, again, what Darwin noticed was a real difference in their beaks, and this difference in beaks seemed to be associated with eating different foods. Different islands had slightly different food sources, and a big old beak like this was really good for cracking large nuts that were on one island, but this little tiny beak was really good for catching insects that were on a different island. So the beaks became specified to particular food sources available on the different islands. Okay? So, main conclusion about Darwin's finches. This is a really great example to remember. Little populations of some South American finches got blown to these islands somehow. Okay, one original species, several members blown over various times. The variation naturally in the genes that gave them their beaks, the variation in their beaks enabled certain individuals to gather food more successfully than others in different environments. For example, if you were a finch and you had a beak like this and you lived on an island with big nuts, you did well. If you were a finch that had a beak like that and you lived on an island with big nuts, you didn't eat as well because your beak couldn't crack those open. But if you had this kind of beak where you needed a small beak to get insects out of a tree, then you would do very well, and maybe this guy wouldn't do so great. So, over many generations, again, lots of time, the populations of the finches changed to suit their environment. They accumulated lots of traits that helped them do well in that particular environment. Okay, and slowly over time, as those traits were passed on to offspring throughout the population, a new species emerged. So, differences in beaks allowed finches to successfully feed, certain ones that had the adaptation successfully compete, and then most importantly, please remember this is a key, successfully reproduce. Okay? Passing those good traits on to their offspring. Good traits. Another great example, the Galapagos tortoises. The natives on the island told Darwin that they could tell which tortoise, there's several species of tortoise, they could tell which one had come from which island just by looking at its neck. Some of these islands are more drought prone than others, which means the vegetation is harder to get. The tortoises with the longer necks were always associated with islands that had less vegetation, that the animal might have to reach up high to grab. The ones with the shorter necks and without the raised opening in the shell were from wetter islands where there's tons of vegetation. They didn't have to raise their neck up. Natural selection favored this longer neck gene in this tortoise living in a dry island, whereas natural selection didn't favor the long neck on a well-watered island because it just didn't confer that much of an advantage. Okay? Longer necks reach leaves, and if you live on a dry island, that's an important trait to have. Okay? And that's just showing you some of the different turtle morphology on different islands. Okay? And Darwin's ideas was maybe these small things, these small steps of difference are the first steps in splitting one species off from another. Okay? So, the Galapagos Islands has many unique species. Unique, not completely different, but different from anything else in the world, yet strikingly similar to nearby South American species, yet importantly different. And that's really important. That's what got Darwin to really pondering once he got back from the Galapagos. Why are these so different, yet they do seem to have something in common with these guys that are right over here on South America? Alright, so he returned to Great Britain in 1836, and that's when he really started to try to figure out what he had seen, what he had collected. And it did begin to occur to him that maybe a new species could arise from some ancestor by just over time gradually accumulating adaptations to a particular environment that made it better suited for that environment over time. And remember, we're talking about this would have to be accumulated change in populations of organisms, because one individual can't evolve. One individual can get a mutation and have a trait, but unless that spreads through his offspring and his offspring's offspring and becomes more numerous over generations, it's not evolution. That generational shift has to occur. So, Darwin began writing papers that were describing everything he'd seen, what he had collected, what he'd done. He wrote an enormous book about barnacles, of all things. He had barnacles, fossilized barnacles, that were all over his house, from what I understand, or certainly had a huge collection of them. So huge, I mean, his children thought that everybody had barnacles in their house. I think it's written somewhere that by one of his children that they used to ask their friends when they went to visit someone else, "Where are your barnacles?" because they thought everybody had barnacles in their house. He actually, however, didn't. He began to draft his ideas out about Origin of Species in 1844, and he told his wife he wanted her to publish his writings when he died, because he really didn't want to do it, because he kind of thought that it wasn't going to sit well with some people. The idea that he was suggesting that species weren't put here all at once, fixed, and stayed the same 6,000 years ago, to this day. That he thought the Earth was very ancient, that he thought life forms changed over time instead. In fact, his own wife wasn't real happy that he was writing all of this stuff. She worried about him. She worried that he was getting to ideas and that were taking him away from what the Bible taught. They had a wonderful relationship. She loved him very much, but this was a disturbing idea for some people during this time. And you can see why Darwin might not have wanted to publish, because he kind of worried that things like this were going to come out in newspapers about him and so on, and in fact, that is exactly what happened. So he might not have published until after his death, except for finally one day he got a letter. In 1858 he got a letter from this young man named Alfred Russel Wallace, and he had written a little paper, but this little paper basically had the same ideas that Darwin was coming up with. Now, granted, Darwin had mountains of evidence that Alfred Russel Wallace did not have, but Wallace wrote to Darwin and said, "Hey, what do you think of this?" And Darwin was like, "Oh, this is my idea." And here is Wallace's paper, and this is the cover page of Darwin's book that he eventually published. He did decide that he needed to go ahead and publish. His friends had been telling him, "You can't just sit on this, you need to publish or someone else is going to beat you to it." And finally he did see that that was correct, and wrote to Lyell about it, in fact. And so he went ahead and published in 1859, and that is an original edition of his book. And basically his book had two main thrusts of ideas. They are: evolution explains the unity of life, that we all living things share certain things in common, but yet it is incredibly diverse with so many different variations of life. Think about how true that is. There are some things that all life shares. We all have DNA. Of course, he couldn't have known that. We all have cells, and so on. But there is an enormous amount of diversity that is layered upon that unity. And his other major thrust was that natural selection is what causes change in living things, this adaptive evolution that occurs over time. Now, Darwin didn't really use this term evolution. The term he preferred was descent with modification. The idea is that all of life was related because we all were descended from the same common ancestor that lived a very, very, very long time ago. Okay? And the idea was that as the descendants of that first organism kind of spilled out into habitats over millions of years and got into different habitats, over time these different groups accumulated little changes, little modifications that helped them to survive in the varying habitats. Okay? You really, really need to think of descent with modification very much like this idea of a tree, because that's how Darwin thought of it. The ancestor, the common ancestor to all life would be at the trunk, the base of the tree, and the branches are all the different life forms that arose from that common ancestor, and the tips of the living youngest twigs are the organisms that are all alive today. But you certainly would find quite a few dead branches in here of organisms that have gone extinct. Okay? And a branching point would be a common ancestor that gave rise to both of these branches. So let's consider this in a more straightforward diagram. So this is an evolutionary tree showing relationships of cats to each other, and basically at each fork of this tree there is a common ancestor to all the lines that branch from that fork. So here is the common ancestor to all these cats. Okay. Now, there are some closely related species like lions and tigers, and they are pretty closely related because they share a recent common ancestor, and again that's represented by that branch point. Yet the jaguar and the lion, according to this diagram, are actually even more closely related than the tiger and the lion because they share an even more recent common ancestor. Okay, so the European wildcat and the domestic wildcat, domestic cat, are very closely related because they share a very recent common ancestor. They are both related to the cougar, but the common ancestor to the cat and the cougar is back further, so they're more distantly related. It's just as you are more closely related, here you are, to your parents, here are your parents right there, than you are to your grandparents or to their parents, and so on. You're more closely related to them. Well, same goes here. These guys are more closely related to each other than they are to the wildcat because they are related much further back with their common ancestor. Okay? All right. Here, again, we can see this idea of a common ancestor giving rise to many species, and their branch points represent additional common, more recent common ancestors. Okay? So, it's also important to recognize that most branches of evolution actually are dead twigs. They're dead because 99% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. And we see the evidence for that in the fossil record. There are organisms that simply just don't exist anymore. Their species is not present in living species today. 99% have gone away. And that explains a lot. For example, these are modern elephants, and these are their closest living relatives. Look at this guy. He looks like he's some kind of little rodent, something called a hyrax, and that's a manatee. Yet these are their closest relatives. How can that be? Well, that's because the links between them have all died out. And so superficially these things don't look anything at all alike, but there is a string of common ancestors that link them, though their most recent members have all gone extinct. Okay? Alright, so this is a really, really, really important slide, and I think I'm going to stop here because I want you to be fresh when you hear what's on the slides. You need to know it. So we're going to stop, and I will catch you in the next podcast. Take care.